Imagine standing outside on a clear night, looking up at the moon. That ancient silent disk that has watched over every civilization in human history. Now imagine that same moon suddenly flashing, a silent, blinding burst of light erupting from its surface, visible to every human being on Earth with the naked eye. Not a meteor, not a natural event, a nuclear explosion, deliberately placed there by the United States government. This was not a science fiction story. It was not a conspiracy theory invented on the internet decades later. It was a real classified government-funded study. It had a project number. It had a team of scientists. It had a timeline. And for a brief, terrifying window in the late 1950s, it was considered a serious option in the most dangerous technological competition the world had ever seen. This is the story of Project A1019. To understand why the United States government would even consider detonating a nuclear weapon on the moon, you have to understand the absolute terror of October 1957. Not the Hollywood kind of terror, the real kind. The kind that spreads quietly through government corridors, through military briefing rooms, through the offices of presidents and generals who suddenly realize they are behind, and that being behind might mean losing everything. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. It was a small metal sphere, roughly the size of a beach ball, weighing about 83 kilograms. It did nothing except orbit the Earth and emit a radio beep. But that beep was the loudest sound the Cold War had ever made. It meant the Soviets had a rocket powerful enough to reach space, which also meant they had a rocket powerful enough to carry a nuclear warhead to any city in the United States, and there was nothing America could do to stop it. The psychological shockwave inside the U.S. government was immense. Congress held emergency hearings. The press called it a national humiliation. Eisenhower, who had privately been briefed on Soviet rocket development, tried to project calm. But behind closed doors, the military and the scientific establishment were in a state of urgent, panicked acceleration. America needed to do something. Something visible, something powerful, something that would send an unmistakable message to Moscow, and more importantly, to the entire watching world. Less than a month after Sputnik, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2 carrying a dog named Laika into orbit. The Soviet space program was moving fast, frighteningly fast. And in the offices of the U.S. Air Force, in the labs of defense contractors, in the minds of military strategists who had spent a decade thinking about nuclear deterrence and global power projection, an idea began to take shape. What if America could demonstrate its power in the most visible, undeniable way imaginable? What if it could do something that every single person on the planet could see with their own eyes, something that required extraordinary technological capability, and something that would leave no doubt about American reach and resolve? What if the United States detonated a nuclear weapon on the surface of the moon? The formal study was initiated in 1958. It was given the official bureaucratic title, A Study of Lunar Research Flights. Its internal designation was Project A119. It was funded by the U.S. Air Force and carried out by the Armor Research Foundation, which was affiliated with the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. The man chosen to lead the study was Leonard Reifel, a physicist with real credentials and a serious scientific reputation. Reifel was not a fringe figure. He was a working scientist who understood nuclear physics, understood the space environment, and understood what the Air Force was actually asking him to investigate. The question on the table was simple and deeply unsettling. Could a nuclear device be detonated on or near the moon, and if so, what would happen? The team that assembled around Reifel was small, around 10 people. Most of their identities remain obscure. But one name on that team would go on to become one of the most famous scientists in history. His name was Carl Sagan. In 1958, Carl Sagan was a 24-year-old graduate student. He was brilliant, ambitious, and already showing the extraordinary ability to make complex science comprehensible and compelling. His specific role in Project A119 was to calculate how the cloud of debris and gas from a nuclear explosion on the moon would expand and disperse, whether it would be visible from Earth, and what it would look like. This detail, Sagan's involvement, would not become publicly known for decades, and when it did, it emerged not because the government revealed it, but because Sagan himself had made a mistake. More on that in a moment. Let's pause here to understand the actual science behind what Project A119 was proposing, because this was not simply pointing a rocket at the moon and pressing a button. The physics involved were genuinely complex, and some of them made the idea far more difficult and far stranger than it might first appear. The moon has no atmosphere. This is crucial. When a nuclear weapon detonates on Earth, the explosion creates the iconic mushroom cloud because hot gases rise rapidly through the surrounding air. The shockwave travels through the atmosphere. The fireball is shaped and sustained by air pressure. None of that would happen on the moon. In a vacuum, a nuclear explosion would look completely different. There would be no mushroom cloud. The material ejected by the explosion would expand outward in a cone shape, following ballistic trajectories in the moon's low gravity, with no air resistance to slow it down. Some of that debris would travel enormous distances. For the explosion to be visible from Earth, which was one of the primary strategic goals, it would need to be detonated on the lunar limb, the edge of the moon as seen from Earth, so the debris cloud would be silhouetted against the darkness of space rather than lost against the bright surface. The weapon being discussed was relatively small by nuclear standards, similar in yield to a tactical nuclear warhead, not a thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. But even a small nuclear device releasing energy on the order of a few kilotons would produce a flash of thermal radiation and a visible cloud of vaporized and ejected material. Based on the calculations Rifle's team worked through, the event would likely be observable from Earth with the naked eye, at least briefly. The conclusion of the study, as Rifle later described it, was that yes, it was technically feasible. The physics worked, at least on paper. A nuclear device could be delivered to the moon on the rockets being developed at that time, and the detonation could be made visible to observers on Earth. But the study also contained a number of serious concerns, and those concerns, combined with other factors, would ultimately lead to the project's quiet termination. Here is where the story gets darker, not in a conspiratorial way, but in a very human, very recognizable way. Because the concerns raised within Project A119 were not just technical, they were ethical. And the fact that they had to be raised at all tells you something disturbing about the atmosphere of that era. Rifle's team worried about what a nuclear detonation would do to the moon itself as a scientific object. In 1958, serious planning was already underway for what would eventually become NASA's lunar science program. Scientists wanted to study the moon, its geology, its chemistry, its history. A nuclear explosion on the lunar surface would contaminate that surface with radioactive material, possibly for millions of years. It would alter the very thing humanity hoped to study. It would be, in a very real sense, an act of permanent and irreversible scientific vandalism on the nearest celestial body to Earth. There were also concerns about what would happen if the launch failed. A rocket carrying a nuclear warhead exploding on the launch pad or in the upper atmosphere would be catastrophic. The radioactive fallout from a failed delivery could rain down on populated areas. This was not a hypothetical risk. Rockets in 1958 failed regularly. The U.S. space program's early launch history was littered with explosions, malfunctions, and disasters. Placing a nuclear device on top of one of those unreliable rockets was a gamble with consequences that went far beyond a mission failure. And there was the question, never fully answered in the declassified records, of what the Soviet reaction would be. Moscow was watching every American move in space. An American nuclear detonation on the moon might not be interpreted as a demonstration of technological power. It might be interpreted as preparation for militarizing space. It might be interpreted as a provocation. In the most unstable period of the Cold War, that kind of misreading could have consequences that no one wanted to think through. The project was abandoned, most likely before the end of 1959. The declassified records do not give a clean official termination date. But Rifle later said the project was stopped primarily because the potential positive propaganda value was outweighed by the risks: the risk of a failed launch, the risk of international backlash, the risk of contaminating the moon, and the growing realization within the Eisenhower and then Kennedy administrations that the real prize in the space race was not a nuclear flash visible for 30 seconds. It was a human being standing on the lunar surface. That was the goal that captured the imagination of the world in a way that no explosion ever could. Now, let's stop and address something important. Because over the decades, as fragments of this story leaked into public awareness, a number of exaggerations and distortions attached themselves to it. And a documentary that presents real history has an obligation to be honest about what is verified and what is not. You will sometimes hear the claim that Project A119 was intended to trigger a nuclear war, or that it was a secret military strike against the Soviet space program, or that it was part of some larger plan to weaponize the moon. None of that is accurate. The project was a propaganda operation. Its goal was psychological, not military. The target was not the Soviet Union. The target was global public opinion, and specifically the perception of which superpower was more technologically advanced. There is no declassified evidence suggesting it was connected to any offensive military strategy. You will also sometimes hear that the nuclear yield being discussed was enormous, city-destroying, catastrophic in scale. This is also not accurate. The weapons discussed in the context of Project A119 were relatively small tactical devices, chosen in part because they were the kind that could be delivered to the moon on the rockets available at the time. The motivation was visibility, not destruction. The moon has no population to destroy. The goal was a visible flash, not a cataclysm. And you will sometimes hear that Carl Sagan played a central role, or even that he led the project. This overstates his involvement. He was a young graduate student doing calculations as part of a larger team. His role was specific and limited. He was not the architect of the plan. What is verified is this: the project was real, it was government-funded, it was scientifically serious, it was ultimately abandoned, and it was kept secret for roughly 4 decades. Leonard Reifel himself confirmed the existence of the project in a 2000 letter published in the journal Nature, after a journalist named Carl Davidson revealed details of Sagan's involvement while writing a biography of Sagan. That revelation is what broke the story into public awareness. Which brings us back to Carl Sagan and to one of the stranger subplots in this story. In 1959, Carl Sagan applied for a prestigious graduate fellowship called the Miller Research Fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley. Fellowship applications at that level typically require applicants to describe their research experience. In filling out that application, Sagan apparently referenced his involvement in classified government research. He did not describe the details, but the reference itself was a violation of the secrecy agreement he had signed as a member of the Project A119 team. This detail was first reported by Carl Davidson based on documents he found while researching his 1999 biography of Sagan. Reifel confirmed it when he went public in 2000. Whether Sagan did this intentionally, out of ambition, or simply failed to appreciate the seriousness of the classification is not known. He died in 1996, 4 years before the story became public, and was never able to address the question directly. There is something achingly human about that detail. A brilliant young scientist, eager to advance his career, mentioning on a fellowship application that he had done classified research, not realizing, or perhaps not caring enough to stop himself, that this small act of self-promotion would sit in a file for 40 years and eventually become a footnote in the history of one of the strangest ideas the Cold War ever produced. And the United States was not alone in thinking this way. In 2015, a Russian physicist named Sergei Voivodin reportedly described a Soviet plan that was roughly parallel to Project A119. The Soviets, facing their own internal pressures and their own anxieties about the space race, had reportedly discussed a plan called Project E4, which would have involved detonating a nuclear device on the moon, for broadly similar reasons: to demonstrate capability, to assert power, to be seen. Details of the Soviet program remain much less documented than the American one, and the historical record is considerably murkier. But the parallel, 2 nuclear superpowers independently considering the same act of cosmic vandalism, is deeply revealing. It tells you something about the psychology of that era. Both sides were so consumed by the need to appear powerful, so driven by the logic of deterrence and demonstration, that they were willing to consider permanently marking the face of the moon with the signature of their competition. The moon, which had circled this planet for 4.5 billion years, had survived the collision that formed it, had watched the rise and fall of every dynasty and civilization in human history, nearly became a casualty of a 40-year political argument between 2 nations that had existed for less than 2 centuries combined. In 1969, 11 years after Project A119 was quietly set aside, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. They came in peace for all mankind. Those words were chosen carefully. They were meant to draw a line between what the space program could have been and what it chose to become. But standing in the long shadow of that achievement, knowing what we now know, those words carry a weight that the people who wrote them may not have fully intended. Because the journey to that moment of peaceful arrival passed through some very dark corridors. It passed through a room where serious scientists sat around a table and calculated how to make the moon explode visibly enough to impress the people of Earth. It passed through years of classified decisions, abandoned plans, and strategic calculations in which the moon itself was treated not as a destination or a wonder, but as a surface on which a message could be written in nuclear fire. The triumph of Apollo was real. The courage of the astronauts was real. The scientific achievement was extraordinary and genuine. But so was this. Both things exist in the same history. Leonard Reifel, in his 2000 letter to Nature, said that he was relieved the project was never carried out. He said he was glad that cooler heads had prevailed, that the decision had ultimately been made to pursue the moon through science and human exploration rather than through detonation. He expressed genuine concern about what the long-term effects on the lunar surface would have been. He seemed, reading between the lines, to be a man who had done his job honestly and thoroughly, who had delivered the answer his employers asked for, and who had privately hoped they would choose not to use it. That is the quiet, unglamorous shape that moral courage often takes in large institutions. Not a dramatic refusal. Not a public protest. Just careful, honest work, a set of concerns clearly stated in a classified report, and a private hope that the people making the decisions would make the right one. They did. This time. The real lesson of Project A119 is not that the United States was uniquely reckless or uniquely aggressive. The lesson is about what fear does to human judgment. In 1958, America was afraid. Not irrationally afraid. The Soviet Union really did have nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and a space program that was visibly outpacing the American one. That fear was real, and it was shared by millions of ordinary citizens, not just generals and politicians. And in the grip of that fear, serious, credentialed, intelligent people sat down and seriously considered permanently altering one of the most ancient and visible objects in the natural world, not for any military purpose, not to gain any tactical advantage, not to make anyone safer, but simply to be seen, to appear strong, to win a perception battle in a conflict that was, at its core, about which political system looked more impressive to the watching world. That is a very human thing to do, and a very frightening one. The moon is still there, unmarked, undetonated, carrying the footprints of 12 human beings who walked its surface between 1969 and 1972, and the quiet, undisturbed record of 4.5 billion years of solar system history. It carries none of the radioactive signature that Project A1119 might have left behind. It carries no visible scar from the flash that could have been seen from Earth on some night in 1959 or 1960 if different decisions had been made. But it also carries the shadow of what was almost done to it. And that shadow is part of the real history of space exploration, not the version told in jubilant documentary footage of rocket launches and ticker tape parades, but the version that lived in classified files and scientists' private fears and the sleepless arithmetic of a young Carl Sagan calculating nuclear cloud dispersal by lamplight somewhere in Chicago. Space history is not only about glory. It never was. It was also about terror and competition and decisions made under pressure that the public was never told about. It was about the willingness of nations to treat the cosmos as an arena and the willingness of individuals to carry out calculations whose implications they could see clearly and could not always stop. The moon survived the space race, but the space race left marks on the people who fought it, and on the record of what human beings are capable of imagining when they are afraid enough and when the stakes feel high enough. Look up at it tonight. It is still there, and now you know exactly how close it came to being something else entirely. Script based on verified historical sources, including Leonard Reifel's 2000 Letter to Nature, Kieh Davidson's biography of Carl Sagan, and declassified records relating to Project A1119, officially titled A Study of Lunar Research Flights, conducted in 1958 by the Armor Research Foundation under U.S. Air Force sponsorship.